Welcome to the January 2025 edition of your u3a podcast. Would you believe it's our 47th edition? It's so lovely that you've joined us again. Well, we are in full swing of January already, and where on earth did that first 2 weeks go? We've got some really interesting topics to share with you. You'll hear about the fantasy world of fairy tales.
The Grimm brothers are terrifically important because they were the first to pick up the notion of recording stories told to them and trying to write them down.
You'll hear about cruising, and it's cruising with a difference.
And then a big part of that as well is all the little details throughout the ship. So these times, the lanyard that you get your room key on, for example, is now made of recovered fishing net that our guests themselves have actually recovered from beach cleanups that we do on all of our itineraries. And we've harvested those materials and had them recycled to create the very lanyards that our guests wear on board.
We also invite you to help support a crucial part of our history by helping ensure future access to our public pathways.
I've walked on a path that is prehistoric, that goes back thousands of years, and I'm doing exactly the same thing that people did 3,000-4,000 years ago, walking down that path. And so I think they need to be protected for that reason as well. You know, they are part of our historic environment that really needs to be protected long into the future.
And finally, we'd like to entice you to consider participating in improvised comedy.
One of the things I always say is that you don't have to try to be funny. In fact, that's an absolute killer. The humour arises quite naturally out of the way the scenes progress.
How's that for a diverse offering? A great start to the new year. Now, you may have noticed that I don't sound like Peter Clift. Our sincere thanks to Peter for such a brilliant job as our broadcaster for the past 4 years. He has decided it's time to pass the baton on to someone else. So, aren't I the lucky one? My name is Maggie West, and I'm delighted to be with you for the foreseeable future. Let's get stuck into the first topic that I promised you. So, do you fancy delving into the fantasy world of fairy tales? I'm sure we've all heard and read a fair few fairy tales as we were growing up. Well, the York u3a discovered there was an adult appetite for the subject, and it's led by a retired teacher called Graham Frater, and he has an enduring fascination with them. He's been telling Joanne Watson about the origins of these stories, and believe it or not, even James Bond gets a mention.
Fairy tales go back an enormously long way. Before we even learnt to write, we were telling stories. A number of those very early stories, or bits of them, seem to survive right through to the great folktale collecting era. People travelled and listened to stories and so on, and are therefore in part of our folk and fairy tales today. I mean, you remember Cinderella is set a horrible task to sort lots of different grains, lentils from beans and things. Well, that happens way back in the story of Cupid and Psyche in Roman times, and probably before that too, and seem to have spread around the world.
And I suppose a fair amount of reinvention went on as well. But what about your 3A group? Are they full of fairy tales and folklore themselves?
They joined because it seemed so strange that somebody would want to talk about fairy tales, and they stayed because it was fun. We're going to be looking at a number of interesting tales about spinning, because tales about spinning show us the kind of female role and how very important it was. Also, there's a strong element of trickery, which is quite fun.
Is there a sort of structure to how a fairy tale is as we know it now?
Yes, there is. Quite a lot of them. And we had a lot of fun about this when we did a session on James Bond. Because James Bond stories are perfect fairy tales. Bond is a sort of hero. And this was all analysed way back before Bond even was born by a Russian scholar. He showed that the king sending off his sons on quests was the dispatcher. And you get exactly the same in Bond with M. M is the dispatcher. He sends Bond off to solve a world problem. And on the course of his journey, he meets up with false helpers and enemies and villains, and he has real helpers, usually Felix Leiter of the CIA, the girl. Many fairy tales end up with a marriage. Well, Bond doesn't marry them, but he floats off in a boat with them and that sort of thing. But it is exactly the same structure. Actually, lots of novels are written on similar lines. Jane Austen's heroines are put into a kind of trial situation and they end up marrying, having been tested, because many of these stories are tests.
If someone says that there's a fairy tale ending to a story, we always think of it as being something good. But I always think there's something quite sinister about some of these folk tales.
There are some very sinister folk tales and horrible punishments. The nailed barrel, where the villainess, because it usually is a female villain in that case, is put into a barrel and rolled down a hill until she's killed by all the nails and the pain and all the rest of it. So yes, there are grim bits, literally grim too. And the Grimms tell a story of the children who played slaughter in a little village somewhere in Germany. They'd all seen the pig killed and they played killing pigs. But one of the children was the pig and really was killed. The little boy who killed him is tried. Very interesting kind of moral judgment starts to come in. Was this child mature enough to know what he was doing? And one of the wise counselors offers him two things. One is an apple and the other is a guinea. Whichever the child chooses shows that he either is or is not morally responsible for what he's doing. The child chooses the apple and everything ends happily ever after.
When the Grimm brothers started writing theirs, did they sort of have to sanitize some of these stories, do you think?
Much too much, yes. The Grimm brothers are terrifically important because they were the first to pick up the notion of recording stories told to them and trying to write them down. And they made a huge collection. But with every edition of their book, they kept on altering things and taking sexuality out of them, reducing the element of violence. And you won't find the children who played slaughter in the last volumes and so on of what they did.
What about biblical tales? In essence, some of them are folk tales, even fairy tales.
They are indeed. One scholar, a chap called Alan Dundas, says they're all folk tales. The story of the flood, for instance, existed well before the Bible was actually written down, because it occurs in the Epic of Gilgamesh, who is Assyrian, certainly Middle Eastern, and well before the Jewish religion got going. The very essence of the stories in the Bible means they were folk tales before anyone thought of them being holy or sacred.
Why do you think there is still a modern appeal for these? I mean, Disney will think it's fantastic, but what about everybody else?
They are in a fantasy world, but a lot of very real things happen, like jealousy, various forms of competition, being tested and coming out of it successfully. So they're telling truths about life in a fantasy framework. And I think that's part of their interest and certainly part of their enduring appeal.
Many thanks to Joanne Watson for that enlightening insight. And it makes you think, maybe our real world is okay after all. So, how about a cruise? Here's the next thing that I'd like to offer you, the opportunity for a cruise. And I'm sure many of the members, are experienced cruisers already. Perhaps you're now looking for one that's a bit different. Maggie D talked to Alistair Newton from HX, who's the company who offer just that. Now, I've got to give you a bit of a spoiler alert here. You will need to wrap up warm.
Alistair, as Director of Expedition Operations for HX, you've obviously got a lot of experience in this. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. About 20 years ago now, I started as a wildlife guide. I was working as a naturalist on board ships in Alaska and sort of fell into it, really, and quite quickly became an expedition leader, mainly shipbound, but over the years I've led land-based expeditions as well.
And the company that you're with, HX, are there any age limitations for the expeditions?
There aren't. So, except right at the very bottom end, infants, it's maybe not quite appropriate. But children, I actually travelled on one of our expeditions with my children when they were 6 years old, and they can have a fantastic time. And really what it's about is about mentality, the approach. We're often in very remote places, so there are some obviously sort of health concerns, awareness that it's not so easy to pop to the local hospital, as it were, if you're in the middle of Antarctica. So that's where we do recommend people just to take some consideration. But other than that, generally not at all. So it's really about like-minded people going off and exploring the world together.
So somebody at the age of 80 could go with you as long as they had their health okay?
Yeah, exactly, absolutely.
A lot of the cruises and expeditions are in Arctic-type conditions. How sustainable are they as far as the biology there?
It's a really interesting question, and so we're actually ranked as the most sustainable cruise line in the world. It's something that we are very passionate about as a company. Now, obviously, there are some impacts that are outside of our control, such as the impact of air travel, for example. But the way we design our trips is to make them as sustainable as they can be, and that's from the operation of the ship. The Speed, our two leading vessels, the Amundsen and the Nansen, are actually hybrid ships as well. So they have battery systems, just like hybrid cars do, to make them much, much more efficient to operate. And then a big part of that as well is all the little details throughout the ship. So these times, the lanyard that you get your room key on, for example, is now made of recovered fishing net that our guests themselves have actually recovered from beach cleanups that we do on all of our itineraries. And we've harvested those materials and had them recycled to create the very lanyards that our guests wear on board. So we're really trying to create as sustainable a product and experience as possible.
Sounds commendable. And you've got vast experience in areas such as Arctic, Antarctica and the Pacific. So what is it that fascinates and draws you to these frozen landscapes?
Interestingly, the first thing that drew me to the north was an interest in how animals adapt to different climates. And interestingly, where I lived in Fairbanks, Alaska, the coldest I saw there was minus 62 degrees. And the hottest I saw there was 42 degrees in the same place.
That is horrendous, that.
So for me, that fascination was how on earth does an environment cope with such an extreme range of temperature, and the animals and the plant life as well. And so that's really what got me started. And then that was the sort of natural evolution. I first went to Antarctica with the British Antarctic Survey, which got me sort of interested in again, that environment as well.
The thing you do now, is that what you've always wanted to do?
Not at all. So like many kids, I wanted to be a vet. Didn't get the grades to do that, so I went into zoology and then ended up transitioning into more sort of wildlife biology. And really, my full intention was to go on and do master's degrees, PhDs, and research. But I actually had a wonderful advisor at my university in America, Doug Schemmel. And Doug was an ornithologist, but his biggest passion was education. And he really inspired me. And I guess I came from a family of teachers as well, so it's no surprise. But he inspired me that actually the power of education is incredible. And what I discovered through a couple of opportunistic moments was the wonders of working with adults in education, so guiding adults and being able to inspire them, and they're sort of at that stage where maybe they're already able to go home and make a real difference. And so it was really around that education that my inspiration, and almost the exploration and the travel was an aside to that. It was just a mechanism by which to do it.
How do you envisage the changing weather patterns of the world affecting the ventures that you're leading?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think there's a wonderful quote from an Alaskan elder who was asked if they had seen the changes of climate change and what their observation was. And their observation was that the world moves faster now. And what they meant by that is that in places like Alaska, the weather systems have historically been very stable. It's gotten colder every day for half the year and warmer every day for half the year. And now what they're having is a lot of variability. And so it can be cold one week and warm the next week. And I think it's that changeable weather that presents one of the bigger challenges to us, is that it's not as stable and predictable for us in all parts of the world anymore.
Would you be happy to just give a brief rundown of what a guest on one of your expeditions would experience?
A guest on one of our expeditions is going to have their experience really centered around the place that they are and learning and diving more deeply into it. So on our ships, the center, the heart of our ships is a science center. And there's a lecture theatre, but there's also tables with microscopes. We have skeletons of animals. This day and age, there are wonderful things called bone clones, so they're actually scanned reproductions of skeletons, so you can handle them. So it's really about that diving deeply into the place that you are. So, for example, right now our ships are in Antarctica, and a typical day would include a landing on shore and usually a Zodiac cruise as well. And so that would be getting out and experiencing that place in different ways. Now, on top of that, there'll usually be a lecture on board, talking maybe, for example, it could be about penguin biology or about whale biology or about the history of exploration in Antarctica. There may be a science boat going out where our guests will get to conduct plankton trawls themselves if they wish to conduct research. It's real research contributing to universities and organizations around the world. They might be on deck doing cloud observations for NASA, for example, one of our partners. And, of course, interspersed in all of this are wonderful meals as well. So usually our guests feel pretty much this is a full-on experience.
Well, that certainly is cruising with a difference. How adventurous are you? Are you tempted? Thanks again to Maggie D for extending our world of opportunities for those of us who are brave enough. From the world of cruising to the world of walking and horse riding. Now, many of us, including me, I'm sure, enjoy a good old walk or even a horse ride. And we're lucky enough to have an abundance of pathways across the country that we live in. But did you know we're in danger of losing 49,000 miles of pathways because they're not officially recorded? It was a surprise to me. And Maggie D spoke to Jack Cornish, who heads up a campaign which is focusing on ensuring we have future access to our public rights of way.
He is the champion of the campaign to improve public paths in England and Wales. He has walked, in 2017, he walked from Land's End to John O'Groats. That's 1,550 miles, in case you're wondering. And he is head of historical paths and director of England at Ramblers Association. And then he's identified 49,000 miles of paths that could be lost forever because they are not legally recorded public rights of way. He's the author of a book called The Lost Paths, and that's a history of how we walk from here to there. And he's appeared on BBC, Country Living magazine, and The Guardian. And on top of all that, he creates art through marquetry. I am very intrigued, as are, I would imagine, most of the listeners at this point, about this business of lost paths. Can you tell me something more about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so in England and Wales, we've got over 140,000 miles of recorded and protected public rights of way, so footpaths and bridleways, etc. And they're shown on legal maps of paths. They're, usually signposted, and there'll be, they'll appear as those green dashes on your Ordnance Survey maps. But there are potentially 49,000 miles of paths that are not on those legal maps. They're not protected and recorded in any way at all, and so they don't have any sort of legal protection, and people might not know they're there. They might not have been used for many years, and they could easily get built over or blocked. So sort of adding those paths to the map and bringing them back and reviving them would massively increase the places we can go walking and riding and cycling across the country.
Well, there might be people who say, so, why bother? We've got lots of paths we can cycle on. There are lots of footpaths already. So why is it important?
Well, I think there's really two reasons why it's important. One is a very practical one. We have, in some places, a path network that doesn't quite make sense. We've got whole parishes with hardly any paths next to a parish with loads of paths. We've also got paths that stop in the middle of nowhere. We, are missing some of these connectors between networks of paths, so people have to walk on busy roads, and we want people to maybe drive less or just enjoy the natural beauty of the countryside. We need a path network that really makes sense and that connects communities across the country. But also, and this is a sort of central theme of my book, The Lost Paths, I believe that, these paths are a crucial part of our history. Most of these paths were created by people walking or riding for very sort of practical reasons, and actually paths are the oldest part of our history that are still in use for their original purpose. I've walked on a path that is prehistoric, that goes back thousands of years, and I'm doing exactly the same thing that people did 3,000-4,000 years ago, walking down that path. And so I think they need to be protected for that reason as well. They are part of our historic environment that really needs to be protected long into the future.
So as you walk along them, you gain a sense of longevity and being part of a more than just that moment.
Exactly. You're literally walking in the footsteps of thousands of years of people that came before. I mean, I walked one of the paths I write about in the book called the Dorsetshire Gap, and that is a sort of meeting of 5 hollowways that have been worn down by centuries and centuries of feet and hooves into this amazing, really deep paths that sort of plunge deep into the earth, and that you really get a sense of that history that you're walking through when you walk through those paths. But even around those paths and in that landscape, there are other paths that are not recorded and not protected in any way at all, and so we're really missing out on making sure that we can protect part of our history if we don't get these paths recorded.
And I believe there's a deadline that we have. If we haven't recorded them by then we've lost them, as you say. Yeah.
So currently there's the deadline in England of the 1st of January 2031 to get these paths recorded, and that might seem like a long time in the future, but actually, when we think about there potentially being tens of thousands of these paths and each application to get it recorded that are fantastic volunteers that the Ramblers and other organisations do, they go back through loads of historical records, and they go back through old maps and old parish records and really uncover the history of these paths. So that, it can take quite some time, and certainly the Ramblers and I believe that, we shouldn't have that deadline. We shouldn't have an arbitrary deadline on recording this sort of crucial part of our history.
And is that just the Ramblers who can record these things, or can anybody pick a footpath and check whether it's been recorded or not?
Yeah, anyone can get involved. Anyone can make an application to the local council. As I say, we've got almost 1,000 volunteers working at the Ramblers, and we always welcome anyone. You don't have to be a member or be involved with the Ramblers before, but there's fantastic volunteers from the British Horse Society, from the Open Spaces Society, or just individuals that have made applications, or parish councils. Anyone can make an application to get their local paths recorded and protected if they're not already.
So does each local authority have a record, hold a record of the ones that have been recorded?
There have been, yes. So the ones that have been, they're on what's called the definitive map. So that's the legal record of public rights of way. Anyone can ask to see that. Quite a lot of councils have it online as well, so you can sort of see what paths are already recorded. Also, if you're looking at the ones that may have been missed off, that 49,000 miles of potential lost paths is available for people to view online. You can just go to, if you just search "Don't Lose Your Way" in the Ramblers, you can get access to that map and see where there might be paths that are, right on your doorstep that could be recorded and open up more of the countryside for everyone.
So if a person discovers one that is not there, but doesn't particularly want to go through the Ramblers, they go to the county authority, I imagine, and is there somewhere online there that they can just simply say, OK, this is what it is and it needs to be recorded?
Yeah, the county councils or the unitary councils that are responsible for this. So yeah, you can go to them to flag that it's not a path recorded. Ultimately, there needs to be some evidence for that, and so that's where the Ramblers are involved in supporting getting that evidence. But people can do that themselves, and the council should be able to give some information about what sort of evidence is needed, get a path recorded and put back on the map.
So it seems that this is a crucial part of our history, so perhaps you could get involved. Thanks, Maggie, for highlighting something that may need our u3a support. Finally, in this month's edition of our u3a podcast, I'd like to present you with an opportunity to get involved in improvisation comedy. What's that, I hear you say? I'm sure you've seen the TV programme Whose Line Is It Anyway? Performers conduct a series of short improvisational games and they create scenes based on a set of predetermined situations. And if you've seen it, you'll know that it's a lot of fun. This is what they called improv comedy. And Bob Wells caught up with our very own u3a subject advisor, Jim Palmer, and his wife Cher to tell us more.
Improv is actually short for improvisation. And what improv comedy is about is performing short, light-hearted, hopefully funny sketches, which are made up completely on the spot. We don't have a script. We don't have any scenery or costumes or anything like that. Everything is done entirely in the moment. And everything we have to create from what we do and what we say.
On a sort of virtual stage.
Many of our members would have seen the programme Whose Line Is It Anyway? So it's that sort of thing, is it?
It is very much that sort of thing. I mean, that was the one time actually where improv has got into sort of in the mainstream, though it's been going on for many decades, so certainly from the 50s and 60s. But that programme did introduce it to a much wider audience. And of course, people like Paul Merton and Josie Lawrence, who were improvisers, were first introduced to mainstream television by that programme. The key thing about improvising is that it's a team effort. The improvisers work together, and that's incredibly important. We have a sort of mantra in improv, which is yes and. And what that really means is that you accept what the other person is said as being the truth, the reality, and then you add to it. And that's the way we build the scenes up. And in that way, the people who are in the scene can create something that no one of them could have created on their own. And that's why it's so exciting in a way, because you're there and you don't know what's going to happen yourself in a scene, because you don't know what the other person's going to say. You just have to react to it and take the next step.
And so if anybody's interested in doing it, do they have to be a bit of a comedian to start with? What sort of talents do they need?
Absolutely not. One of the things I always say is that you don't have to try to be funny. In fact, that's an absolute killer. The humour arises quite naturally out of the way the scenes progress. So you certainly don't need any sort of background in comedy or any experience of any kind, quite honestly. Anyone can learn to be an improviser. So all the classes I take, we start completely from scratch, and we learn how to improvise.
Can you tell us about those classes, please?
We start off with some sort of silly warm-up games, which involve everybody in the group, just to get everybody settled down, because it's quite a nervous thing, actually, for people to stand up, even in front of a small group, and perform. So just get everyone relaxed. And then I usually do some exercises which are on a particular aspect of improv, which might be character, it might be what we call justifying things, it might be narrative, telling stories, those sorts of things. And finally, actually doing some scenes. We do things, we call them improv games, because a lot of the scenes, the sort of thing they used to do on Whose Line Is It Anyway? You have kind of rules, that the things you can and can't do in the scenes, and that naturally brings humour as the people in the scene wrestle with the different things or restrictions that they've got.
And Cher, did you sort of get into improv comedy at the same time as Jim?
I tried it out at the same time. I, at the time, felt a little bit old in the group. This didn't bother Jim, but I felt I was too old. I also like the fact that the u3a ones are catered in a way for people who are not so active. I mean, it's wonderful to watch live improv on stage. They're jumping about with excitement, but I'm sorry, I can't really jump about anymore. I think it's great. The way we do it for the u3a is very much better, I think, for older people.
When I first went to my improv class, I mean, I was the oldest person there by at least 30 years. I was 40 years older than most of them, but I didn't find that a problem. I think one of the greatest things about improv is it's incredibly inclusive. Everybody is very supportive because you have to be. That's the way, it doesn't work otherwise. And one of my most important aims in the classes I take is to include everybody and put everybody at their ease, and everyone supports everybody else. And that's what I found. Any improv class I've ever been to has been like that. I started doing an online class. As time went on, we started getting people from different parts of the country, different u3as all over the place, as far afield as Scotland and Northern Ireland. And anybody who's interested in joining, I'd love to hear from them.
If somebody is interested to come along and join, what do they need to do?
So if you go onto the Trust website, go onto the tab that says Learn, then go to Subject Advice, scroll down, you'll find Improvised Comedy there. Just click on that, and then there's a link that will send a message to me.
And what would you say are the benefits for people doing improv comedy? What do they get out of it? Because clearly I can see that you both get a buzz from it.
Also confidence. After doing improv for a while, I actually felt comfortable for the first time speaking in front of a large group of people, which I'd never managed to be comfortable with before. And somebody beautifully described it as, it's such a shame when you grow up you can't have children's parties, and you're grown up to go to a children's party and be silly and play and laugh until it hurts you almost.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, it's a hell of a lot of fun. And I would say that if people have fun at my classes, I've done my job. But I think actually there are an awful lot of benefits that can come from improv. Cher has already mentioned getting confidence, but I mentioned before teamwork, working with other people. But positivity, the yes and idea, the idea that you will accept what other people say, or at least consider what other people say, and sort of take the next step. But above all, I think it teaches you to listen to other people, because you have to listen to what other people say, because you can't do your scene otherwise. And I think that is an aspect that, quite honestly, in almost every aspect of our lives would be improved if we listen to people properly.
Bob Wells there, talking to Jim and Cher Palmer. Sounds like fun, don't you think? And a way of really boosting your confidence level. And remember, anyone can learn to do it. If you're up for it and you want to attend one of Jim's online improv comedy sessions, head to the u3a website. Go to Learn, click on Learn, and then Subject Advice, and scroll down to Improvised Comedy, and that's where you can sign up. Well, it looks like we've run out of time, so I will close the January edition. And remember, this is my very first one, so please go gently with me. We've covered such a variety of topics: fairy tales to Arctic adventure cruising, saving our crucial pathways, and whetting your appetite to take up improv comedy. So, has something grabbed your attention in this edition? And has it encouraged you to want to participate or learn more? I do hope so, as that's what U3a is all about after all. It's been a pleasure having your company today, and I hope you enjoyed listening to our podcast. I've got to say thanks to our guests for sharing their expertise and their knowledge, and to our reporters on this episode, Joanne Watson, Maggie D, and Bob Wells. And guess what? Bob Wells even is our editor and our producer as well. On behalf of the podcast team, this is your new presenter, brand new, Maggie West, signing off for now, and I'm really looking forward to having your company in the next edition.